Hi, everybody. This is Navneet Mathur. Corey, thanks for that intro. And I'm the Senior Director of Global Solutions here at Neo. And happy to also have Andrew Chumney join me from Pitney Bowes. I'll let Andrew do his introduction in his section shortly. But let's dive right in. Also, we have just 2 poll questions I think would be very interesting to not only us, but all of you as well. So I think Corey is going to get started with the first poll question here, and then as we get into it, we'll have another question a little bit later. But just give you a moment here, and let's get started with the agenda.
So we'll give everyone just a minute to go ahead and complete the poll question on who's leading your GDPR program. Already see a ton of answers coming in. It looks like a lot of legal and compliance teams are leading this initiative, followed second by CISO and CIO. So give everyone just about 10 more seconds.
Great. Yeah, thanks for putting in those poll responses.
All right. Thanks so much. Now I'll hand it back over to you.
Great. So from an agenda perspective, we know that GDPR will impact your business. So we'll talk about, the shapes and forms and how GDPR impacts your business. Then we'll talk a little bit about, how to essentially ensure that your enterprise is looked upon as trustworthy. What does that mean? From a people, process, and technology perspective, right? Cover this holistically. And then we'll have Andrew talk a little bit about Pitney Bowes and the Data Hub product and how they look at GDPR. They have authored a pocket guide on GDPR, and I think Andrew's going to talk about that as well. And then I'll go back and talk a little bit about why graphs are the right sort of technology to implement your GDPR solution. And then we have a demo for you that Alex from Neo as well is going to do for us. He's one of our field engineers and consultants, so we'll do that, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to get started. How can we help you get started on your GDPR journey, or if you've already started, how do we engage to make this successful before the deadline here? So that's from an agenda perspective, and so here's sort of the background. Here's how GDPR sort of came about, just to give you a historical perspective. People have been sort of readily giving away their personal information in return for free services over the years with the online commerce and everything like that. And this has sort of become the norm, or the terms of the trade almost by accident. So what this has sort of resulted in is, to give you a good example, recently, Tesco gave some interesting offers to their consumers based on their buying behavior, and offered them some of their favorite treats at discounted prices and so forth. This Tesco is a British, very large British retailer. But then they also sort of use their data they also provide insurance services, and so they use this data to provide insurance services, and a lot of the consumers thought that was, a very sneaky way to use this data, and were not very happy with it. So we're seeing this type of thing happen again and again, and this has been sort of a result of partly the dot-com bubble bursting, and then this data, companies needing to make money, and this data is a very convenient vehicle that they have already got from all these consumers and people all across the globe to not only trade this data, but then also display advertisements leveraging this data so that they could make money. And so, the consumers in online giants are locked in this awkward embrace where people don't know how to really control their data. They don't know how much it's really worth, and do they really want to deal with the hassle of managing all of this data, right? And so it has come now to the situation where more and more there's awareness of this fact with individuals. And you know, if you look at sort of data from Europe, which has enacted this regulation on, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, 80% plus of Europeans feels that they don't wholly control their online data, and they worry that firms may use their data for purposes other than those advertised. So it's a big concern, it's a growing concern, and finally there's a lot of awareness, and you know, something had to give. So in April 2016, this GDPR Act was ratified by the European Commission, and then it basically enforces that personal data belongs to the individuals and that they have the right to ensure it is protected. And it's all about data protection, personal data protection, especially for European residents right now. And in the US, you know, you may relate to it as, you know, PII, personally identifiable information. Right now, from a GDPR perspective, it applies to any organization, large or small, that does business in Europe or has personal data of EU residents. So that means a lot of US firms that do business there or have EU data within their organization are impacted by GDPR. So that's a very, very large set of organizations across the world. And you know, the statistics say that you know, PwC did a little research here that you know, over 90% of companies are, especially the large multinational companies, are impacted by this and are spending millions of dollars on GDPR readiness. And a very recent survey at RSA, which is a security conference, global security conference here in San Francisco, recently responded to a survey saying that, you know, almost half of those said that nobody's really pushing GDPR preparation. So I think that there's, while this has been around for a long time, since 2016, firms are still grappling with how to deal with it, and we're seeing that, you know, all across, especially in the U.S., and that's why I think this has becoming more and more critical for organizations to take action and get ready, because the deadline is May 25th of 2018. You know, GDPR, as I said, will definitely impact your business if you have European data with you, personal data. And so the liabilities are pretty stiff. Fines are about 4% of global turnover, or 20 million, whichever is higher, and it is for each instance of the breach. So if you have a $1 billion company, you're talking about $40 million for each instance of the breach. So that's very, very serious money. And if your firm is even smaller in terms of your global turnover or revenue, let's say you're 100 million, which would 4% would be only 4 million, but you would be fined 20 million pounds. I mean, sorry, 20 million euros. So that's very, very significant for a smaller firm. So these fines are very, very tough. And in addition to that, there's also personal liability that is being talked about. There's a bill in the UK Parliament on the Digital Economy Bill. This is talking about personal liability for officers of corporations, where they will become personally liable for payment of these fines, you know, as a result of nuisance calls or you know, using this personal data in ways that was not originally intended for or agreed to by the individual. So this is very serious when you start talking about personal liability as well. This is not yet law, but there is a strong likelihood that it will take some shape or form. So if you also look at, this is actually reality in terms of data fines being, stipulated by the European Commission. So Google, for example, was recently fined, 2.4 billion euro for manipulating the search engine results. They were putting the results of partners and things like that over other results, and so that was a breach of sort of the data that they have and fair trade, and so they were imposed this fine. So these fines can be very, very huge, and they're getting more and more serious about this. Also, another good example is the NHS, the National Health Service of the UK, had illegally handed Google's firm DeepMinds, which is an AI firm, 1.6 million of patient records, and that was again called out, and legal action was being taken against NHS, which is essentially a government organization in the UK. So the government is sort of cracking down on itself here, so which is very interesting. In terms of the accountability, what we are seeing is that the personal information scope, which is essentially the amount of attributes that cover personal information, is actually increasing. That is coming under the ambit of GDPR, but also the regulatory leeway is decreasing. So essentially, more and more regulatory pressure is being put, while the information that you have to manage is increasing. So the scales are really tipping in terms of the accountability that organizations have to display, and that's a serious amount of dollars, both in terms of the cost to make sure that all the controls and regulation is adhered to, but also in terms of the fines that they may be liable for in case of a breach. Also, if you look at some other data from Eurostat, which is a statistical organization in Europe, they say that 28,000 DPOs will be required in EU alone. A DPO is essentially a data protection officer. This is again another area of the regulation where organizations of certain size, and especially if they have partners having personal data, they need to have a data protection officer. This is a role and not necessarily a separate person, but for large organizations, it could very well likely be a separate person. This is essentially a combination of a chief data officer that understands the data across the enterprise, and also the data controls and so forth, data privacy regulations and laws, but also a chief information security officer that understands how to keep this data secure. What are the methods of data transfer across organizational boundaries, across territorial or country boundaries, and how to ensure that the data crossing these boundaries is very, very secure. And so they need to not only understand the law, but manage the risk in terms of doing periodic audits, in terms of having the right controls, being on top of it, where the data is moving within the organization and out of the organization, how are they acquiring the data, all of this stuff, and become sort of the point person for the customers or for the individuals, which may not even be customers if they have data on individuals that are not customers, and also for regulators. So this is a key role, a new role that will be required, and organizations have to gear up for this. Also, there's really no passing the buck. If you are, as an organization, have all your data stored with a cloud provider, for instance, or have data with other partners, you are liable. They are liable too, but you are accountable and liable as well. So there is no passing the buck to a cloud service provider that we have, all our data there, and if a data breach happened, it's their problem. No, it's both your problem and your provider's problem. So, and it requires, online services to make it really easy for customers to transfer the information to other providers and even competitors. So you have to have provide that ability to all the individuals to be able to not only provide consent, but also be able to have the right to be forgotten, the right to transfer data, and so forth. I'll talk about it a little bit more on the next slide, but that is all part of this regulation. So how do we make sure as an organization we are viewed as a trustworthy organization? Of course, we need to show good data management practices, policies, and ensure that the processes are in place, and all the people are actually trained for this purpose, and there's general awareness of GDPR within the organization. Because the impact is pretty widespread. So let's break it down here. What data do you have? I think that's really critical in trying to understand your and inventory your data assets, especially from a personal information perspective. Why do you have this data? Where actually are you using this data? Do you know the systems? Do you know the processes that have this data? Actually, are you using every bit and pieces of the data that you have on an individual? If you're not, you're better off cleansing that data and reducing the risk by removing the data attributes that you are really not using within your organization. Where is this data located physically? Both in terms of the systems, but also in terms of country boundaries. So geographically, and how is this data being transferred? If an application is using this data and the application is sitting in a different country physically, it's with a cloud provider, but your data is within your four walls, that would constitute a data transfer across organizational boundaries and territorial boundaries. So you need to make sure and you have a really good understanding of that and the data movement. How did you obtain this data? Do you have traceability in terms of where you got this data from? Perhaps from a partner, perhaps from a web form. All that needs to be very clearly identified, and you have irrefutable proof of the data source and the fact that you got explicit permissions or consent to use this data. You need to record that fact, because when regulators come after you, you should be able to show that. When did you get this data? So getting the timestamps and all of that stuff associated with that as well. Who has access to this data within your organization, outside your organization? And so some people training might be required as well here to make sure that people are aware, especially when you might have a situation where you have people in the US having access to European data, normally, within a particular location, let's say your IT hub or your data center. But then let's say your employee travels outside the US for a vacation, but they need to check on this data. They need to do something work-wise from a remote location. You need to be aware of that fact that they might be accessing that data remotely, and what does that mean? So all of these things need to be taken into account while planning for this. Of course, data security is paramount importance. And then finally, maintaining a map of this data. Like I said, you need to understand this data from where it's sourced and how that sort of traverses your organization and where it gets accessed, where it gets transferred. So having a map of all of this data is absolutely critical for you to really be able to have the right controls in place. And then, like I said, giving people the access to not only provide you the permission to use this data, to transfer this data, and respect the right to be forgotten. So if they don't want their data to be used anymore, they had given you permission earlier, they need that ability to be forgotten or right to modify the data as well. And then, of course, planning for data breaches. What are you going to do? How are you going to notify all these individuals? How are you going to notify the regulators? What remedial actions do you need to take in case of data breach? All that planning has to happen. It's kind of like akin to a disaster recovery plan, if you will, in the IT world. So that's a lot of information to digest. Corey, perhaps we could put up the next poll question before we move on to this slide here.
All right. You'll see that on your screens now, so just take a second and go ahead and submit your answers. All right, so we'll just give everyone about 30 seconds or so. We already see some answers coming in, so thank you. It looks like as of this moment in time, about 80% are using homegrown implementation, and about 20% have something, but it doesn't address GDPR. So I'll give you just about another 10 seconds.
Yeah, really interesting responses, I think, from my perspective. I was expecting a little more folks using COTS products, but I can understand that the GDPR being quite new and it has different requirements, that people would choose to kind of build it themselves. Great. Corey, are we good? Yeah.
Yep. There you go.
All right. So so what do we really need to do? Given all of that information, I think one of the first things I would recommend is implementing a robust data governance platform. If you don't have one already, even if you have one, make sure that you are able to define a data definition and a business glossary of the data, especially in the case of GDPR, having all this personal data, having clear definition of what that data is, and actually tagging that as GDPR compliant data, so that you can track that very much more easily, and being able to track any CRUD operations, create, update, access and delete operations on that data, tying in relevant processes that operate on this regulated parts of this data, so that you have a sense of which processes actually operate on this data. And as time goes on, these processes can increase or decrease, and having that insight is really helpful to tracking what happens with this data. And then, of course, I talked about the map, building the map of this data, how it's being used, how it's being sourced, and that's really the reverse lineage capability that I talk about here. So being able to map that data flow. And of course, most organizations do have a data lifecycle management process, but making sure that is re-looked into from a GDPR perspective, and the right processes and policies are there for each step of this process. Implementing a visual dashboard of KPIs. So KPIs, for instance, for your DPO, the data protection officer, what KPIs is he or she going to track over time? How much personal information you have, how much personal information is increasing over a period of time, how many people are asking for changes to this personal information, how many people are asking for exercising the right to be forgotten. All these types of metrics need to be available to DPOs so they can kind of understand what's going on with all of this personal data, and also appropriately report out to the board, which is liable, which is accountable, and also to regulators as well. And then, of course, providing a portal or a programmatic interface like an API for individuals to provide the consent, update the data, revoke consent, transfer data to other competitors or other companies, and view their rights, right? I think that's a key aspect of this that a lot of organizations actually do not have right now. So this is a critical component that needs to be built in addition to the data governance platform. And then sort of creating a regulatory governance steering group led by the DPO that ensures that all aspects of this law is being adhered to and managed, and the control points are in place. Next, we'll have Andrew. Andrew talking about Pitney Bowes and the Data Hub. So, Andrew, why don't you go ahead, introduce yourself, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate everyone joining the webinar and coming to hopefully not be too scared by what was presented a minute ago. So to give you some background, I've been in the consulting industry for about 25 years. I've done large data warehouses, large ERP implementations. I was recently recruited by Pitney Bowes to come in and help with a product set that's more data hub-like. And one of the reasons for them recruiting me specifically is because I was one of their customers. I bought it, and I really appreciate the architectural flexibility that it gave me for my particular use case. So one thing that people don't know about Pitney is Pitney is actually one of the top 100 software companies in the world. We do a lot of software. Most of our software is kind of behind the scenes. We do a lot of enablement for a lot of functionality for a lot of very large organizations. Many of which you use on a daily basis. But in this particular case, we're going to talk about the Data Hub. And with that, I want to start off with some specifications. So the next slide that I have kind of looks at what are the things that CIOs are looking at, and what are the things that give them the most concern about being compliant with GDPR. And clearly the right to be forgotten. If you haven't thought about this problem or you haven't looked at it in your own context, when you think about the referential integrity issues that are innate to most of your operational systems, going in and just deleting a customer just due to transitive closure issues is something you just don't do, right? It's not something that most applications even support, and something that you have to think about very prescriptively as to how you're going to go about the implementation of that kind of requirement. And then secondary to that is data protection by design and by default. Again, a lot of these systems were built with none of these requirements in mind. Henceforth, clearly with the question that was posed earlier of how are you going to go about solving this problem, most people are looking at homegrown because, quite frankly, there aren't any COTS solutions or very few COTS solutions, and many of them just haven't matured enough or gotten expansive enough to take into account a lot of the architectures that I'm sure everyone on this phone call has. And with that, you're looking at the investment of where you're looking to be compliant, and identifying solutions and accessing costly data. You're going to see a demo in a little bit of how Neo and how the graph database supports a lot of those requirements. But we're really going to talk about the Data Hub and how we put some actual UI in front of that, and hopefully to give you some velocity to kind of achieve the problem. So the next slide kind of indicates what's the difference between a kind of a traditional relational database approach and a graph approach. Clearly the rigor and structure of a relational database has its own inherent positive properties and negative properties. And when we talk about this kind of problem, that rigor, that structure of that relational database becomes an inhibitor of doing that discovery and coming to a solution. And in my particular case, I was faced with a problem where I had 150 disparate systems that were across the technical ecostructure. And within that ecosystem of having that many systems, it was further complexified by the organization was a very acquisitive organization. So they acquired a lot of companies, anywhere from 6 to 12 in a given year. And so we couldn't ever just lay down and say, you know, this is what the architecture is going to be, and this is what the architecture is going to look like. Because quite frankly, you know, a month from now, our board may tell us that, hey, we just bought this company. And so now we've got to integrate them into our ecosystem. And so architecturally, what we designed was having a data hub foundation that all of these systems plugged into. And to kind of give you some feeling for that, the next slide is kind of a graphic that gives you an understanding of how the data hub looks and how the data hub kind of works. So when you look at this overall network of information, that's kind of what a graph record looks like. And so when we come into that graph record, what you're going to see is a customer. And a customer, in this particular case of an insurance company, you know, may reach out to a website portal, and with that website portal, they've now created an interaction. They've now created another customer record in another system. And then they may make a claim. Well, a claim may, again, be in 3 or 4 different systems. Again, I have different customer interactions there. And then from that claim, they may call a call center. Again, I have another customer interaction there, another customer record. And then I have a commercial policy and a commercial fleet where, again, that customer, that personal information record is now attached to vehicles and a claim and a policy. And even more interestingly, especially with GDPR, I may have a third-party information. You know, we always talk about this in the context of our customers that we have. But what if I have personal identifying information that's third-party to me? That's you know the other participant in this accident that just happened that I have to know about as part of my legal action. Am I responsible for that? Yes, I am, because that's personally identifiable information as well. So it's not just on your traditional systems where you think I'm gonna go through this funnel and understand who my customers are and care for those, but you have to be also aware of all of the third-party information that you're gathering as part of your experience that you're doing. So our next slide kind of looks at how our traditional MDM architectures have varied over time, right? When we first started doing, traditional master data management, we'd stand up a silo, and that silo would have governance on top of it. And within that silo, we would, manage it as prescriptively as possible, and most importantly, with the fewest number of elements possible, right? We'd look at, customer name, address, maybe some contact information, email, maybe a Twitter account, and we'd manage that in an MDM environment traditionally. But over time, we've realized that defensive posture, that single system solution to MDM, really wasn't conducive to making our systems effective and efficient. And so we started normalizing that data across the entire enterprise. So now we've got customer information sprawled everywhere. Some of it for analytics reasons, some of it for performance reasons, some of it just by pure way we capture the information in those systems that we're actually doing that interaction. And so we no longer have this highly centralized place where customer or personal information lives. It's now all over the enterprise. And so to look at that from a different context, now we're looking at the data hub. And the data hub from Pitney Bowes really looks like this. We have a data integrator, which is ETL or batch processing or CSV ingestion or however we want to pull data into the hub. We have this real-time services engine, which allows us to go interact with these systems on a real-time basis, on a transactional basis. We have this validation engine, which allows us to do all the traditional MDM stuff of this merging and this matching and this understanding of all the records that we have. And then we have an analytics component of it. And the analytics component really is kind of more geared towards, the dashboarding aspects that Nav spoke to earlier as to how you're going to identify what systems are using what data, how the data goes across the organization, how it's being consumed, how you're being compliant, where you may have compliance issues, where geographically things are being consumed, and things of that nature. So the data hub holistically kind of solves a lot of the problems related to how to get compliant very quickly. So next slide. So the reference architecture really kind of outlines all of the functionality that's available from the Pitney Bowes solution offering. I highlighted everything in green, which is really, this is what you would have to implement from the data hub perspective to get to a platform that would probably get you to compliance for, you know, a company that we could put our minds around for the GDPR requirement set. So even though you're implementing a lot of technology, there's still availability for you to enhance the data hub and to get more business value out of it. So, you know, rather than just being a prescriptive solution to get you to be compliant with the GDPR requirements, as you know, Nav outlined in the slide that had the blue blocks on it of what are all the things you need to be you know, have governed data and be compliant. There's other aspects of when you implement a hub like this and the architecture that you would need to do it, how you can leverage that further across the organization. And so if you took the entire data hub and implemented it into your organization, now you get that ability to extend the functionality and to realize greater business value rather than just solving a problem of a compliance issue, right? Currently today we have a lot of implementations that we're doing that are data hub centric. And so to do a data hub implementation, we look at, you know, data profiling and federation to do that. So we need to understand, you know, where does all the data live? How do we consume all this data and bring it into the data hub? And then how do we use the federation engine to understand where those high velocity transactions are living, because we don't want to pull those into the hub. And so we have two real solutions for that, which is, again, as Nav went through earlier, we need to understand, you know, do the full ontology of the environment to understand where the data exists that we need to be caring for, and then also how do we federate to that data. Our next slide indicates how we do the data matching, right? It's that validation engine I kind of described a minute ago. Like any MDM system, we have a very robust data matching capability, and in fact, Pitney Bowes owns a significant amount of intellectual property around this data matching engine. And in my opinion, probably one of the most prescriptive data matching engines on the market. Because we not only match on a specific data element, but we have 56 different algorithms that we can use for that data matching process that we want to do. So it's not just a fuzzy match or a soundex match or some other kind of prescriptive algorithm. Well, we can do some very prescriptive and also linguistic matching. You know, when you think about the challenges of routing mail everywhere around the world, which Pitney does on a daily basis, a lot of those algorithms are derived from that. So next slide. And so ultimately what we want to come up with is that data merging and that data survivorship. So when we recognize across multiple systems that that person A is really person A, or these two people may be different, we want to understand and put context around them to make sure that we are caring for that record across multiple systems. And so we understand that Chuck Kane is really Chuck Kane and also Charles Kane, which he may appear in our systems in different contexts, because Charles Kane is his legal name. So we want to understand that Charles Kane, Chuck Kane are the same person. We want to be able to merge those records together in the graph database, not in the systems of record, potentially. And within graph, we can then keep that traceability, keep that matrix to understand that if Charles Kane ever approaches us and says, I need you to forget me, we know all the systems that Charles Kane and Chuck Kane appear in, and we can do our prescriptive action to make sure that we forget Mr. Kane and all of his data usage. Next slide. And so real-time services, this is probably one of the most interesting parts of what we do with the Data Hub, in that the real-time services, in the time that it took to actually draw this slide, we can actually publish a real-time service. We go select out of the Data Hub the elements that we're looking for, we provide a name for that service, and we publish it. It seems like black magic, but in a sense, it's the fastest way to create a SOA-based architecture and having this rich Data Hub underneath it. And with that, the extended comment on that is Pitney Bowes has been one of the longest partners with Neo4j. About 5 years ago, I believe, is when the partnership actually started, and was one of the first to market with a graph database, Data Hub, and MDM solution, and have been leveraging that since. And so it's been a pleasure having a conversation with the webinar and participating with this. And with that, I'll call next slide, which kind of finishes me out, and we can go actually look at how Neo4j works. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed one. Data governance and stewardship, probably one of the important parts of this. The stewardship and governance for us allows us to look at the overall lineage of the data, how we manage the data and what we actually consume that data with. This portion of the functionality of the data hub is probably most germane to the GDPR conversation. And with that, it provides us with a full understanding of lineage, which takes advantage of the ontology that we did before. It takes advantage of the integrations that we're doing within systems and gives us those metrics back as to how we're using the data and what we need to make sure that we care for going forward in the governance pattern. So next slide.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for the partnership and to participate in this webinar here. Really appreciate it. So really quickly, I'm going to go through 2 slides here on why graphs. I think Andrew made a really great case for that in terms of the number of hops that you need to do in order to track this lineage, and number of processes, number of applications, number of systems that are tracking this data, that are using this data. It goes into hundreds, if not thousands, and in some large organizations, many, many more. So relational technology is really not a good fit for maintaining relationships that are multi-hop in that way. And so that's why graph databases are actually designed for this purpose. And for this type of dynamic data where the data is also changing on a periodic basis, on a regular basis. That is why I think relational database technology is not a really good fit for this type of a solution. Why Neo4j? We are a native graph database. What that means is that we can, we're a whiteboard friendly model. So the model that you discuss with the analysts, your business analysts on a whiteboard, that's exactly the model that that is implemented physically in our database. So we're not going through this translation of logical model to physical model and so on, and denormalization and normalization and all of this stuff. It's what you see is what you get. And because of that, you have a lot of agility in your entire sort of solution development cycle. We are completely ACID compliant database. We do not lose any data, unlike some of our competition who ensure eventual consistency, which is basically a fancy word of saying that they may lose some data. We don't. And also from a performance perspective, we are basically operate in memory for the most part, and we store pointers to the related entities within. So if you have a data in a node which is a piece of data, like a person, we store their address information, their social security number, whatever else, all these pieces of data that is related to this person. We have the pointer to that data within the node itself, so we can just look at CPU arithmetic and go after the next pieces of data in that manner. So we're extremely fast, and because we are CPU bound, not looking up indexes all the time to go for the next memory location. And we have lots of tools and procedures that improve developer productivity. And from a footprint perspective, we're very efficient from a hardware perspective, requiring less storage, requiring less CPU for a unit of processing. So we can go through more of those details. There's lots of YouTube videos and other material on our website, but in the interest of time, I want to turn it over to Alex Batanov, who is one of our field engineers, who's going to go through this demo of Neo4j. I know you guys have been waiting for that. So Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Nav. Thank you for the presentation. Hi, everybody. My name is Alexander Batanov. I'm on the field team here at Neo. We only have a few minutes left, but I want to show you guys. And by the way, guys, can you see my screen? Nav and Corey?
Yep, we're good.
Showing this beautiful picture of Côte d'Azur. So the use case and the example that I'm going to be talking about today is a fictitious bank, but it's based on a real-life experience that I had working in the financial services. So we're going to show you this Banque d'Azur, which is a bank in the south of France that's catering to the UK citizens. So obviously the customer data moves the boundaries, country boundaries here. And I'm going to show you how Neo is a perfect tool to store information about your data lineage. So here we're looking at the Neo4j browser. That's our admin tool to look at the data that exists in Neo. For our purposes, this is what we have. There's a lot of data in this database. It's all sample data, but we're going to be talking about data elements, because in order for DPO to implement controls in the organization so that things like data breaches can be addressed, what is the scope? I do need to know where these data elements are stored. For, as we were saying with the Pitney Bowes tool, the right to be forgotten or the right to be erased from the systems. There are a lot of dependencies. So before you click on that button, you may want to do some sanity check and see how data is connected. So for our purposes, we're going to talk about the data elements, predominantly around customer data, because it's subject to GDPR, but also some other data is part of this demo. We're going to talk about the systems, and we're going to talk about the apps. And I'm going to show you a couple of queries, how you can run queries to show data lineage. But first, real quick, I'll show you what the setup, which systems are we talking about. So this is the architecture. We'll talk about 4 different entities. On the left, you see the Royal Albion Bank that provides funding for the accounts that are created by Banque d'Azur. It also sends some customer information across the border so that new accounts and new customer IDs can be established. In order for people to leverage banking services, they need to get cards. So the card processor is an entity in the UK that would print the cards and deliver them. Remember, Banque d'Azur caters to the UK citizens who reside in the south of France. At least for this scenario, that's the setup. And then also, Banque d'Azur does not have ATMs. It's a direct bank. So it partners with a local supermarket called Marché du Sud. And Marché has ATMs on its premises that the customers of Banque d'Azur can use for free. In exchange, Banque d'Azur has a commercial agreement with Marché du Sud where it does share the data with Marché in order for Marché to have marketing campaign. The bank can have marketing campaigns as well, but this data needs to be guarded, and I'm going to show you how this can be done. So this is the setup. Let me go back to the browser and just run a couple of queries. I have saved a couple of them right here. So if you look at the data dictionary, for example, and if you want to see all the data that is subject to GDPR, you can easily do it. So Neo is perfect for showing you graphical information. We can also show information in a tabular format if it's a list, for example. Here you see that the data that we're talking about is full name, email. There's a phone and address in the UK that the customer would have, and phone and address in France that the customer would have, local address. And that's where the advertisements can be sent to, for example. And then there are different promotional campaigns, so on and so forth, in addition to account IDs, card numbers, and customer IDs, typical banking stuff. So let me show you how we actually track this data. Again, real quick, I'm going to run this query, and we had to create a ternary relationship that describes how data is being moved. And this is the query that shows that how French address, this is, I hope you guys can see how I drag this node around here in the browser. This address is, first of all, it's stored in different systems. It's stored in the CRM system, right, because you store the data about your customers, and it is also stored in the offer system, okay? But right here, this gray unnamed node, we're using our data model for the purposes of capturing the data movement itself. In addition to being stored in the system, this data element is being moved from a CRM system to the offer system, offer management system. So you can get information like this. This is just a specific view at one particular data movement. Next, I'm going to show you how you can see the data movement across the entire landscape, entire environment of the banks. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, again, let me jump back real quick. So we have inside Bank Deserve an account opening system, we have core banking system, a CRM system where the customer data is stored, a general ledger, which probably does not have customer data, it cares about the balances and things like that, and the offer management system. This is oversimplification, but it's pretty close to the banks that I've worked with in the past. So in the next query, I'm going to show you, for example, how does the general ledger system looks. You may want to use this foundation, this work, to see that there's no data that is subject to GDPR stored in the system. Whereas when we look at the partner system, Marcia do suit, and we run the query, we see that we do give this partner quite a bit of the personal data, full name, email address, phone number in France, and the address in France, as well as the campaign information is being sent there. Next, I want to show you another query which will show you graphically how data for a full name, one of the attributes, is moved in the system, start to finish. So remember, it enters, the full name is being sent by the parent bank, Royal Albion Bank, and goes into Bank Deserve, moves around there from system to system, and then finally it is sent to the partner. So when we run this query, we get this network diagram, and at first it looks like a star, but really when you start dragging things around, so for example, if I take the Royal Albion Bank, and then I look at where does this data go, it goes from Royal Albion Bank to account opening system within the bank. Where does it go next? I drag this node, and then little by little I start seeing the pattern here. This is actually a flow, and it shows me one particular flow of full address attributes start to finish. And just to show what it looks like at the end, when I laid it out correctly, this is it. So you can see that how this data full name is flowing all the way to Marcia do suit in this case. I'll show you another version of this query that actually gives you even broader perspective on how this data can be moved. So here I do the full name data movement across all different systems. It's not just one path, it's multiple paths. And again, if I reorganize this data and I redraw it differently, I give it a different layout, this is what you can see. So here you can see that there are some loops, for example, right? So full name is something that can be updated by the bank personnel, by the operations department, and therefore there is a feedback loop from a CRM system. It goes into core system. It has to be stored there for a legal reason. We're running out of time, but last thing I want to share with you guys, why this might be a great tool. So you know how we use Excel and Visio to store a lot of this data. So what happened today when I was doing this demo, I drew it up first, the mock-up scenario, and guess what? When I ran the query, I was able to discover a bug in my diagram. So the data does flow from CRM to the core system, and I did not represent it on my diagram. But after I ran this query in the bottom left corner of the screen, I was able to find the truth about how data is actually being moved. With that, I'd like to stop, and maybe we do have, I'm going to pass back to Nav, and we're going to decide what we're going to do next.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks for that demo. Hopefully, you guys had a good sense of the product and how you can visualize the data.